Lewis Hamilton has just finished fourth at Spa. Kimi Antonelli has just won his sixth race of the season, and somehow, this is still being framed, in parts of the paddock and across Italian and British media alike, as the weekend Ferrari's upgrade path started to genuinely worry Mercedes. Does that sound like a contradiction to you? It should. Because on paper, the Belgian Grand Prix looked like a Mercedes rout, one that stretched Antonelli's championship lead to somewhere around 45 points over his own teammate. But underneath that result sits a stranger, more layered story. One involving a rear wing, nicknamed after a dance move, an engine allowance handed out by the FIA, under a system almost nobody outside the sport has heard of, and a 7-time world champion who spent all of last season without a single podium finish to his name. So which version is closer to reality? Is Ferrari's development trajectory the real threat to Mercedes' 2026 title defense? Or is that narrative just noise dressed up as insight, a story the sport tells itself because it wants Hamilton's fall from Mercedes to end in redemption rather than decline? Nobody outside Maranello and Brackley can answer that with certainty, but the pieces on the table are worth laying out in full, one at a time. Start with where Hamilton actually stood 12 months ago, because context is everything here. His debut season in red delivered 0 podiums across an entire calendar, a qualifying deficit against teammate Charles Leclerc that stretched to 19 sessions to 5, and a final points gap of 86 behind that same teammate. Hamilton himself reportedly described the experience as something close to a nightmare, an unusually blunt word from a driver who spent nearly 2 decades building a reputation for controlled, diplomatic public statements. Team principal Fred Vasseur later admitted that the team had underestimated exactly what the adjustment would require, describing a season in which Ferrari lost the thread of its own development path somewhere along the way. That is not speculation. That is documented, on the record, the starting line for everything that follows. Which raises the obvious question hanging over this entire story. How does a team go from that kind of collapse to being discussed, even cautiously, as a genuine threat to the sport's dominant constructor barely a year later? The answer, if there is one, lives inside the 2026 regulation reset, and in what Ferrari has quietly done with it since March. Here is where the audience genuinely splits, and neither side is being unreasonable. One camp watches Hamilton's Barcelona victory, his maiden win for Ferrari, and sees clear proof that the new regulations finally follow both car and driver. Another camp watches Mercedes win 6 of the opening races, before Ferrari had touched a single meaningful upgrade, and concludes that the SF26's rise says less about Ferrari's brilliance and more about Mercedes stumbling into unforced reliability failures. Both readings use the exact same set of results. Neither is provably wrong from where we're standing right now. Some believe the upgrade path is the real story of the season. Others believe it is a convenient narrative draped over a championship battle that Mercedes never actually lost meaningful control of, even during its shakiest weekends. Which of those two camps is closer to the truth is, at this point in the season, genuinely unresolved, and may stay that way for months yet. To understand why the upgrades even matter this year in the way they do, you need the plain language version of something called ADUO, the FIA's Additional Upgrade and Development Opportunities System. In simple terms, once power units are approved back in March, manufacturers are normally frozen out of further performance-related changes for the rest of the cycle. ADUO exists as the one sanctioned exception to that freeze. If a manufacturer's engine is found to sit within 2% of the class-leading unit, it receives a single upgrade window. If it falls more than 2% behind, it receives 2. Ferrari has confirmed publicly that it received an ADUO allowance, which in plain English means the FIA's own measurements judged their power unit meaningfully off the pace of the sport's leading manufacturer, almost certainly Mercedes, and granted them an official, rules-compliant path to close that gap mid-season rather than wait until 2027. That single administrative detail, easy to miss in the news cycle, is the quiet engine behind almost every subsequent Ferrari headline this year. From there, the evidence accumulates in layers, each one adding weight, without fully settling the argument. Barcelona brought an aerodynamic package that coincided directly with Hamilton's first win in red. Built around a three-stop strategy that seemed to exploit tire life, the upgraded car protected noticeably better than before. Austria brought a further power unit step, arriving as Ferrari looked to build on the extra horsepower that ADUO had unlocked in the first place. Reports out of Italian media then pointed to a further aerodynamic overhaul planned around the Dutch Grand Prix weekend at Zandvoort, continuing a pattern of near-continuous development rather than a single isolated leap. And by the time the paddock reached Spa, Ferrari brought a reworked rear wing, referred to internally by some outlets as the reverse configuration, and nicknamed Macarena, designed specifically to balance load and resistance through what engineers call corner mode, essentially a low-drag straight-line setup that still has to behave predictably the instant a driver turns in or brakes hard. None of this individual detail is disputed. What remains genuinely unverified is whether all of it, stacked together, adds up to a real title threat, or whether it simply represents a team narrowing a gap that was always going to close somewhat once Ferrari stopped fumbling its own execution from the year before. The countercase deserves equal weight here, because it is not a weak argument dressed up for balance. Toto Wolff has openly acknowledged Ferrari's competitiveness, telling reporters after Silverstone that his own team needed to look inward rather than assuming Ferrari would simply fade away as the season wore on. But Fred Vasseur, in that same window, was the one publicly lowering expectations rather than raising them. Heading into Spa, Vasseur told assembled media that Mercedes still held a clear pace advantage overall, estimating the W17 ahead in roughly 5 of 7 sessions across a typical race weekend. That is Ferrari's own team principal, on the record, explicitly declining to claim parity with the championship leaders. If the man running the upgrade program himself is not willing to say Ferrari has closed the gap, how confident should anyone watching from outside actually be in that claim? It's worth sitting with that question rather than rushing past it. Consider, too, what this means layered against Hamilton's own career arc, because the psychological dimension here is not nothing. This is a driver who spent more than a decade as the benchmark of the sport, who left Mercedes specifically to chase an 8th title with the most storied constructor in Formula One, and who instead walked into a season that, by his own account, felt like the hardest of his career. Some observers see the 2026 upgrades landing on his car as vindication, proof that patience through a miserable first year is finally being rewarded. Others see something closer to a footnote, a driver benefiting from a broader Ferrari recovery that would likely have happened around whichever driver sat in that seat. Which framing you find more convincing probably says as much about how you already felt about Hamilton's move to Ferrari as it does about any specific piece of new evidence from this season. That is worth being honest about, even in a story built around checkable facts. There is also a quieter, more technical layer worth returning to, because energy management, the phrase repeatedly used to explain Mercedes' strength at circuits like Spa, is not just paddock jargon. In simple terms, it refers to how efficiently a car harvests, stores, and deploys electrical energy from its power unit across a lap, particularly under 2026 regulations that lean more heavily on electrical deployment than the previous generation of hybrid engines. A car with strong energy management can sustain higher output for longer without running out of stored power on the straights, which matters enormously at a track like Spa with its long uphill runs. Ferrari's rear wing upgrade was built to compensate for a car that, by most accounts, still lags slightly behind Mercedes in that specific area, using aerodynamic efficiency to claw back what the power unit itself cannot yet fully deliver. Does a clever aerodynamic workaround genuinely offset a deeper deficit in energy deployment, or does it only paper over the problem at certain track layouts while leaving Ferrari exposed everywhere else? That is precisely the kind of question engineers on both sides of this rivalry are reportedly still weighing internally, and it is not one that a single race result can resolve on its own. Widen the lens further, and the pattern only gets more complicated. Mercedes did not stand still while Ferrari developed in the background. Historically, this is roughly the shape a Ferrari renaissance has taken before, even under different regulatory cycles. Flashes of real competitiveness, followed by a gradual reversion toward whichever team simply builds the more complete package across a full season rather than a single stretch of races. Is 2026 fundamentally different because the regulation reset genuinely erased Mercedes's structural advantages built over previous seasons? Or is this the same familiar pattern wearing new paint, one upgrade wave that peaks impressively before Mercedes' deeper resources and experience reassert themselves in the back half of the year? The season simply is not old enough yet to answer that with any confidence, and anyone claiming otherwise is likely speaking from preference rather than evidence. Zoom out to the historical pattern, and the stakes only compound further. Ferrari's championship drought now stretches back to 2008, a gap of nearly 2 decades in a sport where the team has, at various points, fielded some of the fastest cars on the grid without ever quite converting that pace into a title. Multiple driver pairings have arrived at Maranello carrying exactly this kind of hope before, only for the season to unravel through strategic errors, reliability issues, or a rival team simply outdeveloping them in the final third of the calendar. Hamilton is not the first 7-time caliber talent to walk into Ferrari believing this would be the year everything finally clicked. Whether 2026 breaks that pattern or simply extends it is, again, unknowable from where the season currently sits. And longtime observers of this exact storyline have learned to treat every mid-season surge with a degree of caution earned the hard way. What makes this more than a purely technical curiosity is what actually sits on the line for both parties involved. After Silverstone, Antonelli's championship lead over Russell had shrunk to 25 points, and Hamilton himself sat only 32 points behind the outright championship lead, close enough that a small handful of results could have reordered the entire top of the standings within a single race weekend. Ferrari, as a constructor, had clawed back significant ground in that same window, gaining 22 points on Mercedes at Silverstone alone. For a team that has not won a championship of any kind since 2008, and for a driver chasing a record 8th world title in what may be the twilight stretch of his career, none of this is an abstract engineering story playing out in a wind tunnel somewhere in Maranello. It is the difference between a quietly fading final chapter and a genuine, unexpected second act. Every upgrade, every ADUO window, every rear wing revision carries that emotional and competitive weight now, whether or not it is ever spoken aloud inside the paddock itself. And then Spa happened, and the tidy version of this story stopped being tidy at all. Ferrari arrived with the Macarena rear wing precisely built for a circuit featuring 5 straight-line DRS zones, exactly the kind of layout the upgrade had been designed to exploit from the outset. Mercedes, by most pre-race assessments floating around the paddock, was expected to be at something of a disadvantage there, since the W17's core strength has generally leaned on energy management rather than raw straight-line efficiency across a lap. Instead, Antonelli won comfortably, doubling his championship cushion in a single afternoon, while Hamilton collided with Russell on the opening lap in a clash that ended Russell's race entirely and left Hamilton himself facing a post-race investigation into his own driving. So the very weekend built around Ferrari's most targeted, most heavily discussed upgrade yet produced both a dominant Mercedes victory and a fresh controversy involving the exact Ferrari driver that upgrade was meant to serve. Does that single result undercut the entire premise that Ferrari's development curve genuinely threatens Mercedes this season? Maybe. Or maybe one difficult weekend, on a track where circumstances briefly favored Antonelli, regardless of either car's underlying pace, tells us considerably less than it appears to on the surface. Either interpretation remains, at this point, entirely unverified, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise just to give this story a cleaner ending. Even the timing of the Belgian result complicates things further. This race sat right before the summer shutdown, the point in the calendar where teams stopped developing entirely for several weeks, and simply wait. Whatever form Ferrari and Mercedes carry into that break is effectively frozen in place until both teams return, meaning Antonelli's extended lead and Hamilton's own unresolved penalty question will hang over the paddock for longer than a normal mid-season gap would allow. Does a dominant Spa result for Mercedes going into that break means Ferrari's momentum has already stalled at the worst possible moment? Or does a few weeks of downtime simply reset the psychological framing without changing the underlying competitive picture at all? Nobody in the paddock is claiming to know that either, and anyone offering a confident answer right now is likely guessing. So where does that leave the central question this video opened with? Hamilton did technically move up to second in the drivers' standings after Spa, closer to Antonelli than he has been at any other point this season. But he arrived there largely through a rival's misfortune rather than his own car's outright pace advantage, and with a penalty decision still hanging unresolved over his own race weekend. Ferrari's development path is real, thoroughly documented across multiple sources, and backed by an FIA-sanctioned engine allowance that most of the grid simply does not have access to. Whether that path genuinely bends the 2026 title race toward Maranello, or whether it simply narrows a gap that Mercedes' deeper reliability fixes will quietly reopen before the season concludes, is not something this footage, or any single race weekend, can settle on its own. What happens at the next round, and the one after that, will ultimately tell you more than any upgrade nickname or engine allowance ever could on its own. The only honest thing to say right now, sitting here after Spa, is that nobody actually knows yet, not with certainty, and the paddock itself is watching just as closely as you are to find out how this actually ends.